The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. After the death of Gerbert, the decay of the papacy was resumed. The counts of Tusculum, in league with the German emperors, bought bishops and sold the papacy with hardly an effort at concealment. Their nominee, Benedict VIII, 1012 to 1024, was a man of vigor and intelligence, but Benedict IX, from 1032 to 1045, made pope at the age of 12, led so shameful and riotous a life that the people rose and drove him out of Rome. Through Tusculan aid he was restored, but tiring of the papacy, he sold it to Gregory VI, from 1045 to 1046, for 1,000 or 2,000 pounds of gold. Gregory astonished Rome by being almost a model pope. Apparently he had bought the papacy in a sincere desire to reform it and liberate it from its overlords. The Tusculan house could not favor such a reform. It made Benedict IX pope again, while a third faction set up Sylvester III. The Italian clergy appealed to the Emperor Henry III to end this disgrace. He came to Sutri, near Rome, and convened an ecclesiastical council. It imprisoned Sylvester, accepted Benedict's resignation, and deposed Gregory for admittedly buying the papacy. Henry persuaded the council that only a foreign pope, protected by the emperor, could terminate the debasement of the church. The Bishop of Bamberg was elected as Clement II from 1046 to 1047. He died a year later, and Damasus II, from 1047 to 1048, also succumbed to the malaria that now regularly came out of the undrained Campania. At last, in Leo IX, from 1049 to 1054, the papacy found a man who could face its problems with courage, learning, integrity, and a piety long rare in Rome. 7. The Reform of the Church, 1049 to 1054. Three internal problems agitated the Church at this time: simony in the papacy and the episcopacy, marriage or concubinage in the secular clergy, and sporadic incontinence among the monks. Simony, the sale of church offices or services, was the ecclesiastical correlate of contemporary corruption in politics. Good people were one source of simony, so the mother of Guibert of Nogent, anxious to devote him to the church, paid ecclesiastical authorities to make him a cathedral canon at 11. A church council at Rome in 1099 mourned the frequency of such cases. As bishops in England, Germany, France, and Italy administered profane as well as ecclesiastical affairs, and were feudally endowed with lands or villages or even cities to supply their necessary revenues, ambitious men paid secular powers great sums for such appointments, and greedy potentates overrode all decencies to earn these bribes. In Narbonne, a boy of 10 was made archbishop on paying 100,000 solidi, this in 1016. Philip I of France consoled an unsuccessful applicant for one episcopal see with the blithe counsel, "Let me make my profit out of your rival, then you can try to get him degraded for simony, and afterward we can see about satisfying you." The French kings, following a tradition established by Charlemagne, regularly appointed the bishops of Sens, Reims, Lyon, Tours, and Bourges. Elsewhere in France, the bishops were appointed by dukes or counts. Many bishoprics became in the 11th century the hereditary patrimony of noble families, and were used as provision for bastards or younger sons. In Germany, one baron possessed and transmitted 8 bishoprics. A German cardinal alleged, circa 1048, that the simoniacal buyers of sees and benefices had sold the marble facings of the churches, even the tiles from their roofs, to reimburse themselves for the cost of their appointments. Such appointees were men of the world. Many lived in luxury, engaged in war, allowed bribery in episcopal courts, named relatives to ecclesiastical posts, and worshipped Mammon with undivided loyalty. Pope Innocent III would say of an archbishop of Narbonne that he had a purse where his heart should have been. The purchase of sees became so usual that practical men accepted it as normal, but reformers cried out that Simon Magus had captured the church. Among the general clergy, the moral problem hovered between marriage and concubinage. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the marriage of priests was customary in England, Gaul, and North Italy. Pope Hadrian II, from 867 to 872, himself had been a married man, and Bishop Rotharius of Verona, 10th century, reported that practically all priests in his diocese were married. By the beginning of the 11th century, celibacy in the secular clergy was exceptional. It would be a mistake to consider clerical marriage immoral, though often contrary to the canons and ideals of the Church. It was quite in accord with the customs and moral judgments of the times. At Milan, a married priest stood higher in public repute than one unmarried. The latter was suspected of concubinage. Even concubinage, the regular cohabitation of an unmarried man with an unmarried woman, was condoned by public opinion. The great majority of the European clergy led apparently decent moral lives, and all through the Middle Ages we hear of priests and bishops living in saintly devotion to their flocks. Here and there, however, there were scandalous exceptions. In 742, Bishop Boniface complained to Pope Zachary that bishoprics were being given to greedy laymen and adulterous clerics, and that some deacons kept 4 or 5 concubines. And the Venerable Bede in the same century condemned some bishops of England for laughter, jesting, tales, revellings, drunkenness, and dissolute living. Towards the end of the first millennium, such charges became more numerous. Ralph Glaber described the clergy of that period as sharing in the general immorality of the age. An Italian monk, Peter Damian, who lived from 1007 to 1072, presented to the Pope a book ominously entitled Liber Gomorianus, in which he described, with the exaggerations to be expected from his sanctity, the vices of the clergy. One chapter was On the Diversity of Sins Against Nature. Damian strongly urged the prohibition of clerical marriage. The Church had long since opposed clerical marriage on the ground that a married priest, consciously or not, would put his loyalty to wife and children above his devotion to the Church, that for their sake he would be tempted to accumulate money or property, that he would try to transmit his see or benefice to one of his offspring, that an hereditary ecclesiastical caste might in this way develop in Europe as in India, and that the combined economic power of such a property priesthood would be too great for the papacy to control. The priest should be totally devoted to God, the Church, and his fellow men. His moral standard must be higher than that of the people, and must confer upon him the prestige necessary to public confidence and reverence. Several councils had demanded celibacy of the clergy. One, at Pavia in 1018, had decreed a status of perpetual slavery and disbarment from inheritance for all children of priests, but clerical marriage continued. Leo IX found the see of Peter impoverished by clerical bequests of church benefices to clerical offspring, by baronial seizures of church estates, and by the highway robbery of pilgrims bringing prayers, petitions, and offerings to Rome. He organized protection for the pilgrims, recaptured alienated ecclesiastical property, and set himself to the heavy task of ending simony and clerical marriage. Turning over the domestic and administrative cares of the papacy to the shrewd and devoted monk who was to become Gregory VII, Leo left Rome in 1049, resolved to examine at first hand the morals of the clergy and the functioning of the Church in the major cities of Europe. The dignity of his bearing, the unaffected austerity of his life, at once revived the respect that men had held for the highest official of the Church. Vice hid its head as he approached, and Godfrey of Lorraine, who had plundered churches and defied kings, trembled under papal excommunication, submitted to be publicly scourged before the altar of the church that he had ruined in Verdun, undertook to repair the church, and labored in the work with his own hands. At Cologne, Leo held papal court and received every honor from a German clergy proud of a German pope. Passing into France, he presided over a tribunal at Reims, and conducted an inquiry into lay and clerical morals, the sale of ecclesiastical offices, the spoliation of church property, the relaxation of monastic rules, and the rise of heresy. Every bishop present was ordered to confess his sins. One after another, including archbishops, accused himself. Leo sternly reproved them, deposed some, forgave some, excommunicated 4, summoned others to Rome in public penance. He commanded the clergy to dismiss their wives and concubines, and to forego the use of arms. The Council of Reims further decreed that bishops and abbots were to be elected by the clergy and the people, prohibited the sale of ecclesiastical offices, and forbade the clergy to receive fees for administering the Eucharist, attending the sick, or burying the dead. A council in Mainz in 1049, under Leo's urging, enacted similar reforms for Germany. In 1050 he returned to Italy, presided at the Council of Vercelli, and condemned the heresy of Berengar of Tours. With his long and arduous visitation of the north, Leo had restored the prestige of the papacy, replaced the German emperor as head of the German Church, brought the French and Spanish episcopates to acknowledge the authority of the Pope, and made some progress toward cleansing the clergy of venality and venery. In 1051 and 1052 he made further campaigns in Germany and France, presided over a great ecclesiastical assembly at Worms and another at Mantua. Returning at last to Rome, he took on the uncongenial task of defending the papal states by military means. The Emperor Henry III had given him the Duchy of Benevento. Duke Pandulf of Capua refused to recognize the grant and, with the help of Robert Guiscard's Normans, took and held the duchy. Leo asked for a German army to help him oust Pandulf. He received only 700 men. To these he added some untrained Italians, and at their head he marched against the Normans, whose cavalry alone numbered 3,000 buccaneers skilled in war. The Normans overwhelmed Leo's forces, captured him, and then knelt to ask his pardon for having killed 500 of his men. They took him to Benevento, and there, with all courtesy, kept him prisoner for 9 months. Heartbroken and penitent for having taken the sword, Leo wore nothing but sackcloth, slept on a carpet and a stone, and passed nearly all the day in prayer. The Normans saw that he was dying, and released him. He entered Rome amid universal rejoicing, absolved all whom he had excommunicated, ordered a coffin placed in St. Peter's, sat beside it for a day, and died at the altar. The lame, the dumb, and the lepers came from all parts of Italy to touch his corpse. 8. The Great Eastern Schism, 1054. It was in St. Leo's pontificate that Greek and Latin Christianity were finally divorced. While Western Europe was shrouded in the darkness, misery, and ignorance of the 9th and 10th centuries, the Eastern Empire, under the Macedonian emperors, 867 to 1057, recovered some of the territory it had lost to the Arabs, reasserted its leadership in South Italy, and experienced a new flowering of literature and art. The Greek Church drew strength and pride from the revived wealth and power of the Byzantine state, won Russia, Bulgaria, and Serbia to the Eastern observance, and resented more sharply than ever the claims of a debased and impoverished papacy to the ecclesiastical monarchy of the Christian world. To the Greeks of this age, the Germans, Franks, and Anglo-Saxons of the contemporary West seemed crude barbarians, an illiterate and violent laity led by a worldly and corrupt episcopate. The papal rejection of the Byzantine emperor for the papal appropriation of the Exarchate of Ravenna, the papal coronation of a rival Roman emperor, the papal drive into Greek Italy, these galling political events, and not the slight diversities of creed, severed Christendom into East and West. In 1043, Michael Cellularius was appointed Patriarch of Constantinople. He was a man of noble birth, wide culture, keen intellect, and resolute will. Though a monk, he had risen through a political rather than an ecclesiastical career. He had been a high minister of the empire, and would hardly have accepted the patriarchate if it had involved submission to Rome. In 1053 he circulated a Latin treatise by a Greek monk, which strongly criticized the Roman Church for enforcing clerical celibacy contrary to apostolic example and ecclesiastical tradition, for using unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and for adding filioque to the Nicene Creed. In that same year, Cellularius closed all those churches in Constantinople that observed the Latin ritual, and excommunicated all clergy who should persist in its use. Leo, then at the height of his pontificate, dispatched a letter to Cellularius demanding that the patriarch should recognize the supremacy of the popes, and branding any church that refused such recognition as an assembly of heretics, a conventicle of schismatics, a synagogue of Satan. In a milder mood, Leo sent legates to Constantinople to discuss with the emperor and the patriarch the differences that kept the two branches of Christianity apart. The emperor received the legates cordially, but Cellularius denied their competence to deal with the issues. Leo died in April 1054, and the papacy remained vacant for a year. In July, the legates, taking matters into their own hands, deposited on the altar of St. Sophia a bull excommunicating Cellularius. Michael convened a council representing all Eastern Christianity. It recapitulated the grievances of the Greek against the Roman Church, including the shaving of the beard. It formally condemned the bull of the legates and all who had helped in drawing it up, whether by their advice or even by their prayers. The schism was now complete. 9. Gregory VII Hildebrand, 1073 to 1085. It was a great misfortune for Christianity that an interval of chaos and weakness separated the pontificate of Leo IX from that of one of the strongest popes in the history of the Church. Hildebrand is a German name, and suggests a German lineage. Gregory's contemporaries interpreted it to mean Hellbrand, pure flame. He was born of lowly parentage in the hamlet of Savano in the marshes of Tuscany, possibly around 1023. He was educated in the convent of St. Mary on the Aventine at Rome, and entered the Benedictine order. When Pope Gregory VI was deposed and banished to Germany in 1046, Hildebrand accompanied him as chaplain. During that year in Cologne he learned much about Germany that helped him in his later struggle with Henry IV. Soon after his return to Rome he was made a cardinal subdeacon by Leo IX, and was appointed administrator of the Papal States, and at the same time legate to France. We may judge from this remarkable elevation of a youth of 25 the reputation that he had so soon acquired for political and diplomatic ability. Popes Victor II from 1055 to 1057 and Stephen IX from 1057 to 1058 continued to employ him in high capacities. In 1059, Nicholas II became pope largely through Hildebrand's influence, and the indispensable monk, not yet a priest, was made papal chancellor. It was at his urging that Nicholas and the Lateran Council of 1057 issued an edict transferring the election of the pope to the College of Cardinals. By that one stroke, Hildebrand proposed to rescue the papacy from Roman nobles and German emperors. Already the young ecclesiastical statesman had formulated a far-reaching policy. To secure the papacy from German domination, he closed his eyes to the swashbuckling raids of the Normans in southern Italy, recognized their expropriations, and approved their ambitions in return for a pledge of military protection. In 1073, after serving 8 popes for 25 years, Hildebrand himself was raised to the papacy. He resisted, preferring to rule behind the throne. But cardinals, clergy, and people cried out, "St. Peter wills Hildebrand to be pope." He was ordained priest and consecrated pope and took the honored name of Gregory. He was small of stature, homely of feature, keen of eye, proud of spirit, strong of will, sure of the truth, and confident of victory. 4 purposes inspired him: to complete Leo's reform of clerical morals, to end lay investiture, to unify all Europe in one church and one republic headed by the papacy, and to lead a Christian army to the east to reclaim the Holy Land from the Turks. Early in 1074 he wrote to the Counts of Burgundy and Savoy, and to the Emperor Henry IV, begging them to raise funds and troops for a crusade which he proposed to lead in person. The counts were not moved, and Henry was too insecure on his throne to think of a crusade. The Lateran Council of 1059, under Nicholas II and Hildebrand, had excommunicated any priest who kept a wife or a concubine, and had forbidden Christians to attend the Mass of a priest known to keep a woman in his house. Reluctant to break up the families of their clergy, many bishops in Lombardy refused to promulgate these decrees, and prominent clerics in Tuscany defended clerical marriage as both moral and canonical. The legislation could not be enforced, and the idea that clergymen living in sin could not administer valid sacraments was so enthusiastically taken up by heretical preachers that the papal appeal to the congregations was withdrawn. When Hildebrand became Gregory VII, in 1073, he attacked the problem with uncompromising determination. A synod in 1074 renewed the decrees of 1059. Gregory sent these to all the bishops of Europe with a stern command to promulgate and enforce them, and absolved the laity from obedience to priests who disregarded them. The reaction was again violent. Many priests declared that they would abandon their calling rather than their wives. Others deprecated the decrees as making unreasonable demands on human nature, and predicted that their enforcement would promote secret promiscuity. Bishop Otto of Constance openly favored and protected his married clergy. Gregory excommunicated him and absolved his flock from obedience to him. In 1075, Gregory took the further step of commanding the dukes of Swabia and Carinthia and other princes to use force if necessary in keeping recalcitrant clergy from performing priestly functions. Several German princes obeyed him, and many priests unwilling to dismiss their wives were deprived of their parishes. Gregory was to die without victory, but Urban II, Paschal II, and Calixtus II reaffirmed and executed his decrees. The Council of the Lateran in 1215, under Innocent III, issued a final condemnation, and clerical marriage slowly disappeared. The problem of investiture seemed simpler than that of clerical marriage. Assuming, as kings and popes agreed, that Christ had established the Church, it seemed clear that her bishops and abbots should be chosen by churchmen rather than by laymen. And surely it was scandalous that a king should not only appoint bishops, but, as in Germany, invest them with the episcopal staff and ring, sacred symbols of spiritual power. But to the kings an opposite conclusion was equally evident. Admitting, as most German bishops and abbots would have done, that they had been invested by the king with lands, revenues, and secular responsibilities, it seemed meet and just by feudal law that these prelates, at least the bishops, should owe their appointment and temporal allegiance to the king, as they had done without demurrer under Constantine and Charlemagne. If they were released from such subordination and loyalty, half the land of Germany, which had by this time been granted to bishoprics and monasteries, would escape control by the state and their due and wanted service to it. The German bishops and many Lombard bishops of German origin and appointment suspected that Gregory was seeking to end their relative ecclesiastical autonomy and subordinate them completely to the Roman See. Gregory was willing that the bishops should continue their feudal obligations to the king, but unwilling that they should surrender the lands they had received by royal grant. By the law of the Church, the property of the Church was inalienable. Gregory complained that lay appointment had begotten most of the simony, worldliness, and immorality that had appeared in the German and French episcopates. He felt that the bishops must be brought under the papal authority, or else the Western, like the Eastern Church, would become a subservient appendage to the state. Behind this historic conflict lay the question of papacy versus empire. Which should unify and govern Europe? The German emperors claimed that their power was also divine, as being a necessity of social order. Had not St. Paul said that the powers that be are ordained by God? Were they not, according to the popes themselves, the heirs of the Empire of Rome? They stood for the freedom of the part, as Gregory stood for the unity and order of the whole. Privately they resented, so long before the Reformation, the flow of gold in fees and Peter's pence from Germany to Italy, and they saw in the papal policy an effort of Latin Rome to renew its ancient control over what Italy scorned as the barbarian Teutonic North. They freely admitted the supremacy of the Church in spiritual matters, but asserted a like supremacy for the state in temporal or earthly affairs. To Gregory this seemed a disorderly dualism. Spiritual considerations, he felt, should dominate material concerns as the sun dominates the moon. The state should be subordinate to the Church, the city of man to the city of God, in all matters involving doctrine, education, morals, justice, or ecclesiastical organization. Had not the kings of France and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire implicitly admitted that the spiritual was the source and sovereign of the temporal power by accepting archiepiscopal or papal anointment or consecration? The Church, as a divine institution, merited universal authority. The Pope, as the vice-regent of God, had the right and duty to depose bad kings and to confirm or reject the choice made of rulers by men or circumstance. Who, asked Gregory in a passionate epistle to Bishop Hermann of Metz, is ignorant that kings and princes had their origin in those who, ignorant of God, and covering themselves with pride, violence, and perfidy, in fact nearly every crime, claimed to rule over their peers, that is, men, in blind lust and intolerable arrogance? Looking upon the political division, chaos, and wars of Europe, it seemed to Gregory that the only escape from that age-old misery was a world order in which these states should surrender something of their jealous sovereignty and acknowledge the Pope as their feudal suzerain, the majestic head of a universal, or at least a European, Christian republic. The first step toward this end was the liberation of the papacy from German control. The second was to bring all bishops under the authority of the papal see, at least to this degree, that the bishop should be chosen by the clergy and people of the diocese under the auspices of a bishop nominated by the Pope or the Metropolitan, and that the election should be valid only when confirmed by the Archbishop or the Pope. Gregory began with a letter, in 1073, to the Bishop of Chalons, in which he threatened to excommunicate King Philip Augustus of France for selling bishoprics. In 1074 he sent a general letter to the French episcopate calling upon them to denounce the crimes of the king to his face, and to discontinue all religious services in France should Philip refuse to reform. Lay investiture continued there nevertheless, but the French bishops proceeded with caution and left the issue to be fought out in Germany. In February 1075, a synod of Italian bishops at Rome, under the lead of Gregory, issued decrees against simony, clerical marriage, and lay investiture. With strange precipitance, Gregory at once excommunicated for simony 5 bishops who were counselors of Henry IV. He suspended the bishops of Pavia and Turin, deposed the bishop of Piacenza, and ordered Bishop Hermann of Bamberg to come to Rome to clear himself from charges of simony. When Hermann tried to bribe the papal tribunal, Gregory unceremoniously deposed him. He politely asked Henry to nominate a fit successor for the Bamberg see. Henry not only nominated a court favorite, but invested him with episcopal ring and staff without waiting for papal approval, a procedure accordant with custom, but openly defiant of the Roman Synod's decree. As if to make still clearer his rejection of Gregory's demands, Henry appointed bishops to the sees of Milan, Fermo, and Spoleto, almost under the nose of the Pope, and kept in his favor the excommunicated counselors. In December 1075, Gregory sent Henry a letter of remonstrance and commissioned the bearers to add an oral message threatening to excommunicate the king should he continue to ignore the Roman Synod's decrees. Henry summoned a council of German bishops to Worms on January 24, 1076. 24 came, some stayed away. Before this assembly, Hugh, a Roman cardinal, accused Gregory of licentiousness, cruelty, and witchcraft, and of obtaining the papacy by bribery and violence, and he reminded the bishops that the custom of centuries required, for the election of any pope, the consent of the German emperor, which Gregory had not asked. The emperor, emboldened by his recent suppression of a Saxon revolt, proposed the deposition of the pope. All bishops present signed the decree. A council of Lombard bishops at Piacenza approved it, and Henry sent it to Gregory with a choice superscription. Henry, king not by usurpation but by God's ordinance to Hildebrand, not pope but false monk. The message was delivered to Henry at a synod in Rome on February 21, 1076. The 110 bishops there present, all from Italy and Gaul, wished to kill the messenger, but Gregory protected him. The synod excommunicated the bishops who had signed the Worms decree, and the pope launched upon the emperor a triple sentence of excommunication, anathema, and deposition, and released Henry's subjects from their oaths of obedience. This on February 22, 1076. Henry countered by persuading the Bishop of Utrecht to anathematize Gregory, the perjured monk, from the pulpit of the cathedral. All Europe was shocked by the papal deposition of an emperor, and still more by the imperial deposition and episcopal cursing of a pope. The religious sentiment proved stronger than the national, and public support rapidly deserted the emperor. Saxony resumed its revolt, and when Henry summoned the bishops and nobles of his realm to councils at Worms and Mainz, his call was almost universally ignored. On the contrary, the German aristocracy, seeing in the situation a chance to strengthen their feudal power against the king, met at Tribor, on October 16, 1076, approved the excommunication of the emperor and declared that should he not obtain absolution from the pope by February 22, 1077, they would name a successor to his throne. It was arranged between the nobles and the papal legates at Tribor that a diet should be held at Augsburg on February 2, 1077, under the presidency of the pope to settle the affairs of the church and the kingdom. Henry retired to Speyer, defeated and almost entirely deserted. Believing that the proposed diet would confirm his deposition, he sent messengers to Rome, offering to come there and ask for absolution. Gregory replied that as he would soon leave for Augsburg, he could not receive Henry at Rome. En route north, the pope was entertained at Mantua by his friend and supporter Matilda, Countess of Tuscany. Here he learned that Henry had entered Italy. Fearing that the king would raise an army among the anti-papal population of Lombardy, Gregory took refuge in Matilda's fortified castle at Canossa, high in the Apennines near Reggio Emilia. There, on January 25, 1077, at the height of one of the severest winters that Italy could recall, Henry, says Gregory's report to the German princes, came in person to Canossa, bringing with him only a small retinue. He presented himself at the gate of the castle, barefoot and clad only in wretched woolen garments, beseeching us with fears to grant him absolution and forgiveness. This he continued to do for 3 days, while all those about us were moved to compassion at his plight, and interceded for him with tears and prayers. At length we removed the excommunication from him, and received him again into the bosom of the Holy Mother Church. Gregory hesitated so long through no hardness of heart. He had agreed to make no peace with Henry without consulting the German princes, and he knew that if Henry, forgiven, should rebel again, a second excommunication would have diminished effect, and might receive less support from the nobility. On the other hand, the Christian world would have found it hard to understand why the Vicar of Christ should refuse forgiveness to so humble a penitent. The event was a spiritual triumph for Gregory, but a subtle diplomatic victory for Henry, who now automatically regained his throne. Gregory returned to Rome and devoted himself for the next 2 years to ecclesiastical legislation chiefly aimed to enforce clerical celibacy. The German princes, however, proclaimed Rudolf of Swabia king of Germany in 1077, and Henry's strategy seemed to have failed. But now that he had freed himself from the papal ban, he found fresh sympathy from a people not enamored of the nobility. A new army was recruited to defend him, and for 2 years the rival kings ravaged Germany in civil war. Gregory, after long vacillation, gave his support to Rudolf, excommunicated Henry a second time, forbade Christians to serve him, and offered absolution from their sins to all who should enlist under Rudolf's flag, this in March 1080. Henry acted precisely as before. He called a council of favorable nobles and bishops at Mainz. The council deposed Gregory. A council of bishops from Germany and northern Italy at Brixen confirmed the deposition, declared Archbishop Guibert of Ravenna pope, and commissioned Henry to execute its decrees. The rival armies met on the banks of the Saal in Saxony on October 15, 1080. Henry was defeated, but Rudolf was killed. While the rebel nobles divided on the question of a successor to Rudolf, Henry entered Italy, marched unresisted through Lombardy, recruiting another army as he went, and laid siege to Rome. Gregory appealed to Robert Guiscard for help, but Robert was far away. The Pope appealed to William I, whose conquest of England he had sanctioned and helped, but William was not sure that he wanted Henry to lose this royal argument. The people of Rome defended the pontiff bravely, but Henry was able to seize a large part of Rome, including St. Peter's, and Gregory fled to the Castello Sant'Angelo. A synod in the Lateran Palace, at Henry's command, deposed and excommunicated Gregory and consecrated Guibert as Pope Clement III on March 24, 1084, and a week later Clement crowned Henry emperor. For a year, Henry was master of Rome. But in 1085, Robert Guiscard, leaving his campaign against Byzantium, approached Rome at the head of 36,000 men. Henry had no army to resist such a force. He fled to Germany. Robert entered the capital, freed Gregory, sacked Rome, left half of it in ruins, and took Gregory to Monte Cassino. The populace of Rome was so infuriated against the Normans that the Pope, their ally, could not remain there in safety. Clement returned to Rome as apparent pope. Gregory went on to Salerno, held another synod, excommunicated Henry again, and then broke down in body and spirit. "I have loved righteousness," he said, "and hated iniquity. Therefore I die in exile." He was only 62, but the nervous strain of his bitter controversies had worn him out, and his apparent defeat by the man whom he had forgiven at Canossa left him no will to live. There at Salerno, on May 25, 1085, he died. Perhaps he had loved righteousness too imperiously and had hated iniquity too passionately. It is reserved to the philosopher and forbidden to the man of action to see elements of justice in the position of his enemy. Innocent III, a century later, would realize a large part of Gregory's dream of a world united under the Vicar of Christ. But he would win in a more temperate spirit and with wiser diplomacy. And yet Innocent's victory was made possible by Gregory's defeat. Hildebrand had grasped higher than his reach, but he had for a decade raised the papacy to the greatest height and power that it had yet known. His uncompromising war against clerical marriage succeeded and prepared for his successors a clergy whose undivided loyalty immeasurably strengthened the Church. His campaign against simony and lay investiture would win a tardy victory, but in the end his view would prevail, and the bishops of the Church would become the willing servitors of the papacy. His use of papal legates was destined to extend the power of the popes into every parish in Christendom. Through his initiative, papal elections were now free from royal domination. They would soon give the Church an amazing succession of strong men, and 10 years after Gregory's death, the kings and nobles of the world would acknowledge Urban II as the head of Europe in that synthesis of Christianity, feudalism, chivalry, and imperialism, which we know as the Crusades. Chapter 22. Feudalism and Chivalry, 600 to 1200. 1. Feudal Origins. In the 6 centuries that followed the death of Justinian, a remarkable collaboration of circumstances slowly effected a basic transformation of economic life in the West European world. Certain conditions already noted came together to prepare for feudalism. As the cities of Italy and Gaul became unsafe during the German invasions, aristocrats moved out to their rural villas and surrounded themselves with agricultural dependents, client families, and military aids. Monasteries whose monks tilled the soil and practiced handicrafts accentuated the centrifugal movement toward half-isolated economic units in the countryside. Roads injured by war, neglected by poverty, and endangered by highwaymen could no longer maintain adequate communication and exchange. State revenues declined as commerce contracted and industry fell. Impoverished governments could no longer revenues declined as commerce contracted and industry fell. Impoverished governments could no longer provide protection for life, property, and trade. The obstruction of commerce compelled the villas to seek economic self-sufficiency. Many manufactured articles formerly bought from the cities were, from the 3rd century onward, produced on the great estates. In the 5th century, the letters of Sidonius Apollinaris show us rural lords living in luxury on spacious holdings tilled by a semi-servile tenantry. They are already a feudal aristocracy, possessing their own judiciary and soldiery, and differing from the later barons chiefly in knowing how to read. The same factors that paved the way for feudalism between the 3rd century and the 6th established it between the 6th and the 9th. Merovingian and Carolingian kings paid their generals and administrators with grants of land. In the 9th century, these fiefs became hereditary and semi-independent through the weakness of the Carolingian kings. The Saracen, Norse, and Magyar invasions of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries repeated and cemented the results of the German invasions 6 centuries before. Central protection failed. The local baron or bishop organized a localized order and defense, and remained possessed of his own force and court. Since the invaders were often mounted, defenders who could afford a horse were in demand. Cavalry became more important than infantry, and just as in early Rome a class of equites, men on horseback, had taken form between patrician and plebs, so in France, Norman England, and Christian Spain a class of mounted knights grew up between the duke or baron and the peasantry. The people did not resent these developments. In an atmosphere of terror, when attack might come at any time, they craved military organization. They built their homes as near to the baronial castle or fortified monastery as they could, and they readily gave allegiance and service to a lord, that is, a law ward, or to a duke, that is, one who could lead. We must imagine their terror to understand their subjection. Freemen who could no longer protect themselves offered their land or labor to some strong man in return for shelter and support. In such cases of commendation, the baron usually assigned to his man a tract to be held as a precarium, on a lease revocable by the donor at any time. This precarious tenure became the usual form of serf possession of land. Feudalism was the economic subjection and military allegiance of a man to a superior, in return for economic organization and military protection. It cannot be rigidly defined, for it had 100 variations in time and place. Its origins lay in Italy and Germany, but its most characteristic development came in France. In Britain it may have begun as the encirclement of Britons by Anglo-Saxon conquerors, but for the most part it was there a Gallic importation from Normandy. It never matured in northern Italy or Christian Spain, and in the Eastern Empire the great landowners never developed military or judicial independence, nor that hierarchy of fealties which seemed in the West essential to feudalism. Large sectors of Europe's peasantry remained unfeudalized. The shepherds and ranchers of the Balkans, Eastern Italy, Spain, the vine-growers of western Germany and southern France, the sturdy farmers of Sweden and Norway, the Teutonic pioneers beyond the Elbe, the mountaineers of the Carpathians, the Alps, the Apennines, and the Pyrenees. It was not to be expected that a continent so physically and climatically diverse should have a uniform economy. Even within feudalism, conditions of contract and status varied from nation to nation, from manor to manor, from time to time. Our analysis will apply chiefly to the France and England of the 11th and 12th centuries. 2. Feudal organization. 1. The slave. In those lands and times, society consisted of freemen, serfs, and slaves. Freemen included nobles, clerics, professional soldiers, practitioners of the professions, most merchants and artisans, and peasants who owned their land with little or no obligation to any feudal lord, or leased it from a lord for a money rent. Such peasant proprietors constituted some 4% of the farming population of England in the 11th century. They were more numerous in western Germany, northern Italy, and southern France. They probably constituted a quarter of the total peasant population in Western Europe. Slavery diminished as serfdom increased. In 12th century England it was mostly confined to household service. In France, north of the Loire, it was negligible. In Germany it rose in the 10th century, when no compunction was felt in capturing pagan Slavs for menial tasks on German estates, or for sale in Moslem or Byzantine lands. Conversely, Moslems and Greeks were kidnapped by slave traders along the shores of the Black Sea, Western Asia, or Northern Africa, for sale as farmhands, domestic servants, eunuchs, concubines, or prostitutes in Islam or Christendom. The slave trade flourished, especially in Italy, probably due to the nearness of Moslem countries, which could be preyed upon with a good conscience. It seemed a fair revenge for Saracen raids. An institution that had lasted throughout known history appeared inevitable and eternal, even to honest moralists. It is true that Pope Gregory I freed 2 of his slaves with admirable words about the natural liberty of all men. But he continued to use hundreds of slaves on the papal estates and approved laws forbidding slaves to become clerics or marry free Christians. The Church denounced the sale of Christian captives to Moslems, but permitted the enslavement of Moslems and of Europeans not yet converted to Christianity. Thousands of captured Slavs and Saracens were distributed among monasteries as slaves, and slavery on church lands and papal estates continued till the 11th century. Canon law sometimes estimated the wealth of church lands in slaves, rather than in money. Like secular law, it considered the slave as a chattel. It forbade church slaves to make wills, and decreed that any peculium or savings of which they died possessed should belong to the church. The Archbishop of Narbonne, in his will of 1149, left his Saracen slaves to the bishops of Béziers. St. Thomas Aquinas interpreted slavery as one consequence of Adam's sin, and as economically expedient in a world where some must toil in order that others may be free to defend them. Such views were in the tradition of Aristotle and in the spirit of the times. The rule of the Church, that her property should never be alienated except at its full market value, was unfortunate for her slaves and serfs. Emancipation sometimes proved more difficult on ecclesiastical than on secular properties. Nevertheless, the Church progressively restricted the slave traffic by forbidding the enslavement of Christians at a time when Christianity was spreading rapidly. The decline of slavery was due not to moral progress, but to economic change. Production under direct physical compulsion proved less profitable or convenient than production under the stimulus of acquisitive desire. Servitude continued, and the word servus served for both slave and serf. But in time it became the word serf, S-E-R-F, as villain, V-I-L-L-E-I-N, meaning serf or countryman, became villain, V-I-L-L-A-I-N, and Slav became slave. It was the serf, not the slave, who made the bread of the medieval world. 2. The serf. Typically, the serf tilled a plot of land owned by a lord or baron who gave him a life tenure and military protection as long as he paid an annual rent in products, labor, or money. He could be evicted at the owner's will, and at his death the land passed to his children only by consent and satisfaction of the lord. In France, he could be sold independently of the land for some 40 shillings, possibly around $400. Sometimes he, that is his labor, was sold by his owner in part to one person, in part to another. In France, he could abjure the feudal contract by surrendering the land and all his possessions to the seigneur. In England, he was denied this right of migration, and fugitive medieval serfs were recaptured as zealously as fugitive modern slaves. The feudal dues of the serf to the owner of his land were numerous and diverse. Some intelligence must have been required even to remember them. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.